After the Alter Rebbe was released from jail on Yutas Kislev Tov Kuf Nun Tes, 3 years later, the Alter Rebbe was again arrested and again released from jail, and again Chassidim had a second Yontif to celebrate. Once again, the Alter Rebbe was arrested through the efforts of the Misnagdim, that they wrote reports to the Russian government, and because of that, the Alter Rebbe was arrested and again taken to Petersburg for questioning and for interrogation. The Alter Rebbe was arrested on the day of Isru Chag, Tov Kuf Samach Aleph. This is incredible because the day the Alter Rebbe was arrested the second time is the exact same day that he was arrested the first time. Also, Isru Chag, Tov Kuf Nun Tes. The Alter Rebbe was notified during Sukkot. It was the second day of Chol HaMoed, the 18th day of Tishrei. The Alter Rebbe was notified that the day after Sukkot, which is the 24th of Tishrei, he would be going to Petersburg and he would be under arrest. The Alter Rebbe was told that he will be able to take along with him 2 people to escort him. The Alter Rebbe's son, Reb Moshe, was the youngest son of the Alter Rebbe, begged and pleaded with the Alter Rebbe that he should allow him to be the one to escort him. And the Alter Rebbe ultimately agreed. The Alter Rebbe had special feelings for this son, Reb Moshe, and he would say that his kishreinus, his talents, are 10 times greater than the one who he's named after. He was named after the Alter Rebbe's grandfather. The father of the Alter Rebbe was Reb Baruch, and Reb Baruch's father was Reb Moshe. And it's known that this Reb Moshe was a brilliant Torah genius. So the Alter Rebbe said that the son of the Alter Rebbe, Reb Moshe, was 10 times more talented than his grandfather. And Alter Rebbe agreed that he would go along with him to Petersburg. And in general, this arrest was much lighter than the first. As we mentioned in the previous lessons, when the Alter Rebbe was arrested the first time, he went into the wagon which they called the Schwarze Beidel, was a black wagon. People called it the wagon of death, because whoever went with this wagon usually didn't come back alive. They were usually destined to have the death penalty. The first time the Alter Rebbe went, there was nobody from the family or Chassidim that were able to escort him. Here they allowed 2 people to go along with him. Not only that, there were soldiers who were escorting the Alter Rebbe, and they were escorting him with drawn swords. And they were waving their swords in the faces of the Chassidim. The Chassidim, there were thousands of Chassidim, men, women, and children who were following the Alter Rebbe's wagon, crying and screaming and shouting. And the soldiers were waving these open swords in their faces to chase them away and to frighten them. This time the Alter Rebbe went in a wagon that belonged to the government. He went with a wagon that they delivered the mail with. And in fact, in every inn that they stopped, in such long journeys, they would stop off at an inn and trade off the horses for new horses. So they stopped to trade off these horses, and they would give the Alter Rebbe a room in the inn for him to have his private space and to lay down and rest. So this whole trip was with so much more honor and dignity than the first time. In fact, whenever the Alter Rebbe arrived at one of these inns, hundreds of people would come out to greet the Alter Rebbe, and not only Yidden, but also non-Jews would come out to greet the Alter Rebbe with bread and salt. This was their custom and their way of showing respect. It was Friday, the 28th of Tishrei. The Alter Rebbe arrived in Petersburg, and they appointed one of the ministers that he should be the one in charge of the Alter Rebbe. And he came out to greet the Alter Rebbe, and he showed them where the Alter Rebbe's room would be in the prison, which is called Tainim Savet. And they actually appointed 2 people to be there to assist the Alter Rebbe. One was a Jew, and one was a non-Jew. Reb Moshe, the Alter Rebbe's son, said to the minister, "My father is accustomed to davening the tzibur with a minyan 3 times a day, Shachris, Mincha, and Meiris. So perhaps you can arrange that for him here as well." And the minister told him, "I'm very sorry that I won't be able to fulfill your request, but we won't be able to do that here because your father, you, and the other person who's with you will have to be isolated from the rest of the Jewish people." So Moshe said to him, "I'd like to make a suggestion. Let's make a crack in the wall where the Alter Rebbe is sitting, and let's allow Yidden to make a minyan in the next room. So my father could hear the davening, he could hear the reading of the Torah and Kedusha and so on." And sure enough, within a few hours, they made the crack in the wall, and they designated that room that the Yidden could come and make a minyan there so the Alter Rebbe could hear the minyan davening. The Alter Rebbe was in this place in Tainen Savet for 2 months. The day that he came in was Chavches Tishrei, and the day the Alter Rebbe left and was released was Chav Zayin Kislev, exactly 2 months later. During this time period, the Alter Rebbe met more than 20 times with those who were asking him questions. They had more than 20 meetings together, and these were people who were the intellectuals in Russia, that they came to ask Alter Rebbe questions on subjects of Judaism in general, and specifically mysticism, Kabbalah, and Jewish history, especially Jewish history in the times of the Sanhedrin. And there were people, scribes, who would write down all the questions and all the answers the Alter Rebbe gave. Many answers the Alter Rebbe gave in Yiddish. Some answers the Alter Rebbe gave in Lashon Kodesh, in Hebrew. And Reb Moshe would be the one to translate into Russian. And there were times the Alter Rebbe gave Reb Moshe permission not only to translate his words, but to give his explanation and to elaborate on what the Alter Rebbe said. In general, Reb Moshe made a very good impression on the ministers. His physical appearance was striking. He spoke very calmly. He was very articulate. And he explained things in a structured way, in a fluent Russian and in a fluent French. When all the questioning ended, the day the Alter Rebbe was finally released from jail was the 27th of Kislev, which is also known as the Dritte Lichtul. It was the 3rd day of Hanukkah, meaning the 3rd candle of Hanukkah. And this became a Yontif, a day of celebration for Chassidim. However, 3 weeks before the Alter Rebbe was released, they came to tell the Alter Rebbe that basically the judgment is in his favor, and he will definitely be going out of jail. He'll be able to continue all his activities to teach Chassidus just as he wanted to do before. There will be absolutely no interference from the government's part, but it still has to be signed by the king himself, the King Pavel, and also has to be signed by the Senate. And after that, he'll be free. But being that they're up to this point, they told the Alter Rebbe, he can leave the room which was like his prison cell, and he'll be given another place in the Tainem Savet, but in a different courtyard, and this will be like an apartment. Here he won't be guarded by guards, and in fact, Chassidim could come visit him. So, in a certain sense, he was already free, but it wasn't total freedom. And naturally, Chassidim were notified immediately all over that Alter Rebbe is now in a new place, and now anyone can come visit him. And the Alter Rebbe was in a tremendous simcha. In fact, all these weeks that Alter Rebbe was in this apartment, the Alter Rebbe was in a tremendous, unusual simcha. There are a lot of stories about what happened during this time period, but there were Chassidim who came to visit the Alter Rebbe then, older Chassidim who said that they were by the Alter Rebbe for at least 20 years. Some of them said they were by the Alter Rebbe for more than 25 years. And they never saw the Alter Rebbe conduct himself as he did here. He would come out every single day. One of the rooms of the Alter Rebbe's apartment was a large room that was able to hold up to 300 people. The Alter Rebbe would come out every single day and speak to the Chassidim. And they said they never saw the Alter Rebbe do this before, that he would spend every single day time speaking to the Chassidim. And not only the time that he spent, but also the nature of those talks, the nature of the way the Alter Rebbe spoke was totally different than the way he spoke, the way they knew it all the years before. They described it as something so different and so unusual that there are really no words to describe. It's only something which you could feel. If you were there, you could feel it, and that's it. And the Tzemach Tzedek said that he heard from the Alter Rebbe more than once that there was actually tremendous danger on the teachings of Chassidus. The Alter Rebbe explained the difference between the first time that he was arrested and the second time. The Alter Rebbe said the first time, the main focus was on me. The reports to the government and everything was against me personally. Being that it was 30 years already, that I put so much work into teaching Chassidus and spreading Chassidus. And I established many Talmidim who were giants in the knowledge of Chassidus. I was at peace. Although my son, the Alter Rebbe, was still very young, but I was hoping and I was relying on the fact that my students will help him, will assist him. But the second time, the Ikar Haushana, the Ikar reports were against the teachings of Chassidus, not against me personally. Even though they never put out a prohibition against learning Chassidus, because they were waiting for the final investigation to be over with. But nevertheless, that was the main thing, was that they were out to stop the teachings of Chassidus. And at this point, my son, the Alter Rebbe, was already older, and he was already a mashpia, and one who was a mentor for the Chassidim, for the young Chassidim. But I was very much concerned because the opposition against Chassidus was very powerful. So from this we can understand that when finally the investigation ended and they found Chassidus to be something proper and that they gave the green light that Chassidus can continue to be taught, naturally there was great joy and great simcha by the Alter Rebbe. So when finally they had the signature of the king and the Senate and everything was approved, that's when the Alter Rebbe was able to leave the Tainim Savet completely. And they told the Alter Rebbe, even though they're allowing him to go out free, but they want him temporarily to be in the city of Peterburg until they decide where he should live. The Alter Rebbe was very pained by this. Even though they promised him they won't interfere and get involved in any of the Alter Rebbe's activities. Not only that, but to a certain extent they'll actually give assistance to the Alter Rebbe, but still that would mean that the Alter Rebbe would have to be living in Peterburg, and the Alter Rebbe didn't want that. However, when the Alter Rebbe left, this later also changed because of the death of the Tsar Pavel, and the new Tsar that became the king in Russia was Alexander. In fact, there's an interesting story connection to this, that it was Erev, Alter Rebbe was living in Peterburg, and was Erev Pesach, or Shabbos HaGodel. And the Alter Rebbe saw through the window that the king Pavel was driving through in his wagon. The Alter Rebbe looked at him, and he said that the glory of kingdom has left him. And shortly after that, he was killed. The Alter Rebbe actually, that night when it happened, was also very strange. The Alter Rebbe went to his room. Everyone thought the Alter Rebbe was going into his room to rest. 1 hour passed, 2 hours passed, it got dark, Alter Rebbe was still in his room. And everybody was really puzzled by this because it wasn't the usual Seder for the Alter Rebbe. In fact, the Alter Rebbe was in his room until midnight. At midnight, they heard the Alter Rebbe moaning. So on one hand, they were just happy to hear the Alter Rebbe's voice, but they also felt in that something happened. They had no idea what. Suddenly the Alter Rebbe's door opened up, and he said to the people around him, go out and see what's the commotion in the street. And that's when they found out that there were people who had killed the Tsar, Pavel, and his son, Alexander I, became the king in his place. And the second document that he signed was the total freedom of the Alter Rebbe. When this Tsar ascended to the throne, he naturally wanted to be everybody's friend, and he also wanted to be the friend of the Jews. And he knew that in the Jewish community there are three divisions. There are the Chassidim, the Misnagdim, and the Maskilim, who are the people from the Enlightenment movement. So in order to please the Chassidim, he signed a document to release the Alter Rebbe, and he wrote that he prefers that the Alter Rebbe would settle in the city of Petersburg. To please the Misnagdim, he sent 3,000 rubles to the city of Vilna and told them they can spend it as they wish. And to please the Maskilim, he allowed them and gave them permission that the Jewish children could now study in the same schools together with the non-Jews. That was their wish in order to further their plans of assimilation. The Alter Rebbe remained in the city of Petersburg for another few months, and in the summertime, in the month of Av, the Alter Rebbe left Petersburg and he settled in the city of Ladi. And that's when the Alter Rebbe's place changed. Before, the Alter Rebbe was in Lozhna, but after he went out of jail and left Petersburg, he went to the city of Ladi. How did it come about that Alter Rebbe moved to the city of Ladi? Was because, on one hand, the government was saying that they prefer the Alter Rebbe remains in Petersburg, but the Alter Rebbe really didn't like that. And what happened was that during the time when the Alter Rebbe went over to live, when he went out of the prison cell for those few weeks, before he was released, he went out of the prison cell, and he now was in his own private apartment without any guards watching over him, and everyone was allowed to come visit. So a lot of Chassidim came from all over to visit the Alter Rebbe. When the day came for the Alter Rebbe to leave Tainim Savet completely and go to his own personal apartment in the city of Petersburg, there were about 1,000 Chassidim that were escorting the Alter Rebbe from Tainim Savet to his private apartment. This scene was a beautiful scene to see the Alter Rebbe walking through the street and over 1,000 people, 1,000 Chassidim, walking behind him. One of the people that saw this was a nobleman by the name of Lubamirsky. He was one of the important noblemen, someone who had a say in the government, and his voice was heard in the palace. When he saw the Alter Rebbe walking through the street to his house, it had a tremendous impression on him. And at that moment, he decided that he'd like to get to know the Alter Rebbe personally. He heard a lot about the case, just like everybody else heard about it. But here he had a feeling that he'd like to meet the Alter Rebbe face to face. So a number of days after the Alter Rebbe arrived in his apartment, this nobleman, Lubamirsky, made a request that he'd like to have a time where he can come meet with the Alter Rebbe face to face. He had a few questions to ask him. One of the people, the Alter Rebbe's Chassidim who were there at the time, was a Chassid by the name of Avram Kruller. He was a contractor, and he knew this nobleman Lubamirsky, so he spoke to him about the Alter Rebbe and about the Alter Rebbe's greatness, and how the Alter Rebbe doesn't want to live in Petersburg. And he told the nobleman that if he could use his influence and speak to the government, that if the Alter Rebbe would live in one of his cities, one of the cities that are in his estate, then maybe they would allow the Alter Rebbe to leave Peterburg and go to that place. And he explained to him that not only would this be a favor for the Alter Rebbe and for Chassidim, but this would also be a favor for him. Because wherever the Alter Rebbe will live, there will be a lot of Chassidim coming to visit, there will be a lot of activity, and it would promote the economical situation in the city. When the nobleman Lubamirsky did visit with the Alter Rebbe, he told the Alter Rebbe that he's offering him to live in one of his cities, either in the city of Dubrovna or in the city of Ladi. And as Alter Rebbe agrees, he'll speak to the officers in the government that they should allow the Alter Rebbe to move to that city. The Alter Rebbe accepted the offer of the nobleman Lubamirsky, and he chose to live in the city of Ladi. Then Lubamirsky went and spoke to the people in charge in government, and they gave their okay that Alter Rebbe could leave Petersburg and move to the city of Ladi. He gave orders that they should build homes for the Alter Rebbe, for the Alter Rebbe's family. In fact, he appointed this chassid, Rabbi Avram Kruller, the contractor, that he should be in charge and oversee the whole project of the homes that they will be building for the Alter Rebbe and his family. During the time the Alter Rebbe was in Peterburg, he sent shluchim all over to strengthen the Chassidic communities and to reinforce the teachings of Chassidus and the spreading of Chassidus. And wherever these shluchim came, they had a tremendous impact on all the people. And when the Alter Rebbe left Peterburg and traveled to the city of Ladi to settle there, wherever he traveled, people joined the Alter Rebbe to escort him to the city of Ladi. So when the Alter Rebbe arrived in the city of Ladi, he arrived with an enormous escort of 5,000 people behind him. One of the events that happened while the Alter Rebbe was in jail was a very significant thing that took place. One of the times that they were taking the Alter Rebbe from the room where they had the questioning back to the prison cell. There was a little child who was called Nikolai. He later became the future king of Russia, the Tsar Nicholas. He was the brother of this Alexander, and he was playing in the courtyard with other friends from the royal family. By nature, he was a sadist, and he always carried along with him a whip. When he saw the Alter Rebbe, he ran towards the Alter Rebbe and waved the whip in his face in order to frighten the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe looked at him very strongly, and this gaze of the Alter Rebbe had such an effect on the child that he suddenly became weak. The whip fell out of his hand. He lowered his eyes and lowered his head, and he told this person who was watching over him that he feels tremendous fear in his heart from this look of the prisoner. So the Tzemach Tzedek said this was no simple event. In fact, later when the Tsar Nikolai became the king of Russia, the Tzemach Tzedek said the Alter Rebbe had the power with looking to accomplish what other Hasidic masters were able to accomplish through speaking. They needed to speak verbally and give a bracha, or the opposite, to accomplish certain things, and the Alter Rebbe was able to do the same thing with looking. And he said that in this case we see how the Eibishter prepared the refuah kodim lamaka, the cure, the healing before the injury. This child later grew up to be the Tsar Nicholas, who was a very big anti-Semite, and made tremendous gzeirus, tremendous decrees against the Jewish people. And he said by the Alter Rebbe looking at him, he weakened the klipa, he weakened the power of impurity that was contained in him. And had the Alter Rebbe not looked at him and not weakened him, who knows if we'd be able to survive his sadistic decrees. So the Eibishter arranged, Bashgacha Pratis, that this child should be playing just in the same place where they were leading the Alter Rebbe at that time, and that he should run towards the Alter Rebbe with his whip, and the Alter Rebbe should look at him. And as a result of that, this weakens him that in the future, when he becomes the king of Russia, his power of wickedness would not be as strong as it could have been. So this is a concept which we find that Chassidim talk a lot about, how the power of a Rebbe is not only in his speech, but just looking at a person has the power to bring healing and to bring bracha, both physically and spiritually. In fact, there's a story with Reb Shimon Bar Yochai that he ran away from the Romans and he was in hiding for 13 years. And he was in hiding with his son, Rebbe Elazar. So it says that after he was in hiding for 12 years, he came out of his cave, and he lived such a spiritual life, such an isolated spiritual life for 12 years, that when they came out of their cave and they saw people plowing fields and involved in the materialistic world, they took one look at the people, and the field and the plow, everything went up in flames. And they heard a voice, a heavenly voice that said, "Go back to the cave before you destroy my world completely." They went back to their cave. They were there for another year. And this time when they came out, Rebbe Elazar, the son of Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, when he saw people involved in the materialistic world, again, everything went up in flames. But this time, Reb Shimon Bar Yochai looked at the same thing and he healed it. So we see the power of vision by such tzaddikim. He looked at something and he was able to destroy it. Reb Shimon Bar Yochai looked at something, was able to bring healing. And this is similar to what we find here with the Alter Rebbe. In fact, it's interesting, we find in Chumash a similar thing, where it says that Moshe Rabbeinu was told by Hashem that he will not be allowed to enter Eretz Yisrael, but what he should do is go on the mountain, and from that mountain he should look at Eretz Yisrael. The simple interpretation is that although he wasn't given permission to enter the land, he was at least able to look at the land, and in that way, to some degree, satisfy his love for Eretz Yisrael. But there are other commentaries. One of them is Sapurna, where he explains that Moshe Rabbeinu looking at the land was actually to give the land a bracha. By him looking at Eretz Yisrael, that brought a bracha onto Eretz Yisrael. And we also find this by the Eibishter himself, that when the Torah describes the blessing that Hashem gives to Eretz Yisrael, what does it say? Eretz asher ein Hashem alekecha bo, mereishis hashana vad achar shana. This is the land that Hashem has his eyes on the land from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. So although this is only a mashal, it's a metaphor, but the mashal that's used, the metaphor is a metaphor of vision. It's that Hashem is looking at the land, and that's how he gives his blessing to the land. So it's understood from this that tzaddikim, especially tzaddikim of the caliber of the Alter Rebbe, that just by looking at someone, it can have an effect. Both, and like in this situation, where the look of the Alter Rebbe destroyed the klipa in this person, and also the other way, where the look of a tzaddik can bring bracha to a person. And that's why Chassidim always make an effort, not only to see the Rebbe, but to be seen by the Rebbe, to bring our children to the Rebbe, either by Fabrengen or by Dalet, that the Rebbe, by looking at them, this itself gives them a bracha begashmius and a bracha beruchnis. After the Alter Rebbe left Peterburg and came to Ladi, and in general after the second arrest, the Alter Rebbe increased even more his activities of teaching Chassidus, spreading Chassidus, and teaching Chassidus in a greater measure to elaborate on the teaching of Chassidus more than before. There was an increase in the Aveda of Sheyafut Saman Esecha Chut, of spreading Chassidus to the outside. And during this time, the opposition against Chassidus was totally weakened. It was nothing like it used to be before. However, a new kind of an opposition came up, and that was an opposition from other Chassidic Rebbes which didn't exist before. For Baruch Mezhebuzer, the Baram Kalisker, as we'll tell the story about this opposition in the next lesson.